we turn our attention to what might be called the libertarian left, or more popularly, anarchism.
This is the same logic shared by Marx and Freud.
Functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think they are an interesting model that I think is highly relevant.
Hello, everybody. Hi. Welcome to Theoryish. The only cold open story I can give you is that I thought my voice was going yesterday, so I've been sick for the past 2 weeks, and I think you have as well, Paula. Both been sick. It's been horrible.
Yes, I was sick for 2 weeks, but my voice is still somewhat recovering.
Yeah, same.
A bit of an ear infection, and then so we had to push back this recording, and I'm so thankful we did, because I think us with our little croaky voices speaking about witchcraft was gonna sound very strange.
And my voice has recovered for the most part, but then yesterday it was starting to go again. And I've been playing this online video game, Marvel Rivals, and I have discovered I have a sort of rage problem. And so if it's not going my way, I'll yell at the TV. Nobody's on the other end, they can't hear me. So I'm yelling at the TV, and I've been playing it continuously for the past few weeks. Apart from when I was really sick, I couldn't play it. And so Dan, my partner, was looking at me yesterday, and he was like, stop yelling, you're making your own voice go. So I was really worried about today and recording, because I've been yelling and screaming at the TV.
Hannah, I remember when last time I stayed with you, you were like, he plays this game, it's awful, da-da-da. And now look at you.
Oh my God, no, but I'm actually good at it. Dan stopped playing it, but I am really good. Or I think I'm really good. For context, I've made two, for anybody who plays Marvel Rivals, I've made 2 characters proficient, and I'm platinum 2. So I had, you rank up, and it's bronze, silver, gold, and then platinum. And so I'm in platinum, it's great. It feels so good. When it's when you're doing well, it feels so good. But when you're getting your ass handed to you, and loads of people they'll write in the chat, because I'm not on voice, so no one can hear me. So people write in the chat, and they're like, "Yeah, can you stop fucking playing? Because you're shit." Yeah, it's great. Anyway.
I love that this is your free time, because all I did was watch the entire limited series for Apple Cider Vinegar on Netflix.
What is this?
Okay, this is also probably not going to be included in the thing. Honestly, Hannah, it pissed me the fuck off. I watched it twice. I watched it once while I was recovering from not having my pills. Was I need something in the background. Modern Family is too stupid. And I can't be watching X-Files because I'm sad. So accidentally, I chose another show that was I'm sad. So I watched it twice. It's one of those show documentary things. Kind of the one they did about the woman that's the TV show about the woman that scammed everyone in New York.
Oh, yeah.
So it's based on real life, but it's a true-ish story. Apple Cider Vinegar. It's about this Australian woman named Belle Gibson who faked having terminal cancer and was I was able to live because of these homemade recipes. Oh my God. And she launched an app. There's also a maintenance phase episode on her. So if you don't want to watch the entire show, but I highly recommend watching the show. So she faked having terminal cancer. She robbed a family of money because she promised that she would pay for life-saving surgery for their child. That was $120,000 Australian. The kid died. She stole from a bunch of charities, and she owes the Australian government $410,000.
Oh my God.
$500,000. And she had a rival who also was into these home remedies and stuff, and she actually had cancer, and she also died. The show was about how people It's about influence and all this stuff, but it's also about like grifters and
Yeah.
like medical grifters. And Hannah, I was sat. I was in. This is my fascination. I sent it to Louise. I was like, Louise, you need to watch the show because I want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah.
I'm like, girl, this is a Medium article waiting to happen. Start typing. But it's only 6 episodes.
Yeah.
So,
I need to watch.
Highly recommend. Yes, we need to talk about it. But back to the actual thing that we're recording.
So today we're going to be looking at the Malleus Maleficarum, but a particular kind of author's translation. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But I just want to say that this is not my area of study, not my current area, but I'm obsessed with the study of early modern witchcraft in particular. My bachelor's, my BA dissertation was kind of trying to understand why intellectuals in Europe, and I think particularly I focused on like England and Scotland, really understood and cared about witchcraft. And then my master's, I looked at how museums in the UK, Amsterdam, and Salem, Massachusetts kind of represented early modern witchcraft. So I visited the Amsterdam Torture Museum. I visited the Museum of Witchcraft. I forget what it's called. It's like the Museum of Witchcraft in Cornwall. And then I went to Salem, Massachusetts and like looked around and went to a few museums there. So the last time I really properly thought about witchcraft and studied this area was the end of 2016. So this is partly done on memory and partly done on like the little research I was able to do over the past few weeks. So be nice to me if there are any inaccuracies or if I'm not saying this to Paula, I'm saying this to you, the audience. Be nice to me if there's any inaccuracies. But I did try, and I'll try and provide sources for anything I do say. And if I can't find anything, I'll probably just take it out of the episode so you won't hear it. But Paula, do you know anything about early modern or medieval witchcraft or anything about this area?
No. Plain and simple. Like, I don't know much. All I know is like a couple like stories, or not stories, but like a couple micro histories. Like I know about the trial of the dead Pope, where they like dig him up and put him on trial. That is crazy. I know about like the dancing plague and things like that, but I'm genuinely quite dumb when it comes to anything before like the 1800s, to be quite honest, because I was a bad art historian and I didn't care for it. I was like, screw this stuff. So having the opportunity to actually read part of this book, I stand corrected. I was a lifelong hater, kind of like how you feel about black and white movies.
Yeah.
I feel about anything to do with like, you know, pre-New World Europe. Like, I'm like, yeah, y'all don't have potatoes yet. Like, I don't want to listen to you.
Yeah. It's this is my area, or it used to be my area, and I was a pretty not great historian. So but I really I love the study of witchcraft. I think it's so fun. There's so much to it. I think if you're doing early modern history and you're not even like tangentially aware of this area of history, you're really missing out because it's just so interesting. So I'm gonna kind of introduce the author / editor. So Peter Maxwell-Stuart is a senior tutor in the School of History at the University of St. Andrews. He translated numerous Latin texts, which is what we're reading today. He introduces the Malleus Maleficarum, and then most of it is his translation of the Malleus, which was written in Latin. And he is also the author of The British Witch, which was published in 2014, among many other titles. But I'm going to read the book description from Manchester University Press because I think it's just like fun and it gives you an overview of kind of what we're looking at today. So The Malleus Maleficarum is one of the best known treatises dealing with the problem of what to do with witches. It was written in 1487 by a Dominican inquisitor, Heinrich Istitorius, also known as Heinrich Kramer. The Istitorius is his Latinized version. It's the version that is kind of published on the Malleus. But following his kind of failure to prosecute a number of women for witchcraft, it's in many ways a highly personal document full of frustration at official complacency in the face of a spiritual threat, as well as being a practical guide for law officers who have to deal with the cunning, dangerous enemy, combining theological discussion, illustrative anecdotes, and useful advice for those involved in suppressing witchcraft. Its influence on witchcraft studies has been extensive. The only previous translation into English, that of Montague Summers, produced in 1928, is full of inaccuracies. It's written in a style almost unreadable nowadays and is unfortunately coloured by his personal agenda. This new edited translation, with an introductory essay setting Witchcraft Institutorius and the Malleus into clear, readable English, corrects Summers' mistakes and offers a lean, unvarnished version of what Istitorius actually wrote. It will undoubtedly become the standard translation of this important and controversial late medieval text. It's kind of structured, so we read the introduction, then we read a kind of part in part 1 and a part in part 2, and I'll talk more about what that means later. But it's structured according to questions, so there's particular questions that the kind of author is answering using the Malleus. And yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think the introduction in particular is really stellar. It's a very good introduction into this area. I don't know, how did you find it, Paula?
It was absolutely necessary because the author recommended us to just read the part 1 and part 2. And trusting Hannah and her knowledge of this history, I was like, hey, I think this is quite short, especially as I don't know that much. So you having told me to read the introduction was absolutely useful. It really did set up not just the history and what leads into the creation of this manuscript, but it also cements the sort of interwovenness of religion and the status of the Catholic Church at this time. Whereas I know sufficient that the Catholic Church was starting to be disbanded, it was being questioned, and it was full of enemies of the state, like heretics, like quote-unquote heretics. But I think what's really fascinating about it was the inclusion of all of these other characters that lead to the manifestation of this text, where I would not have known this context had it not been like so succinctly put in the introduction.
So this is our first episode that is done kind of in collaboration with Manchester University Press. Manchester University Press is one of the leading academic publishers in the UK. They've been publishing groundbreaking research since 1904. With a commitment to quality scholarship and innovative publishing, Manchester University Press continues to advance knowledge and inspire new discoveries across various disciplines. Apologies if my voice is croaky. We're just going to have to deal with it. But we've got 3 episodes this season that we're doing with them. We don't make any money from these kind of episodes, so this is just us kind of very openly talking about this. But we managed to get you a discount code. Again, we don't make money from the discount code. Use it if you think this is interesting. I highly recommend it for this particular book because I think witchcraft is just fun. But the discount code is Theory30 and it's 30% off the books we're covering. So it will be working, or should be working, from the point when this episode is released till the 23rd of December this year. So, Malleus Maleficarum. And interrupt me whenever you want, Paula. I'm just going to start rambling. People wrote books on witchcraft called works on demonology. So people were really scared, in particular, that the devil was trying to recruit people to work with him. That's why you see witches. I'm going to say the word witches, but witches has a particular gendered element. But think of like witches, people who are using magic, essentially. Witchcraft during this time, and this is like broad scope, so I'm talking about Europe in particular, but I want to make it clear that witchcraft is very geographically, contextually specific, right? And so something that's happening either in England and Scotland and Wales are all happening differently because there's different laws and different things happening. But across Europe, this is the case. And so witchcraft becomes this kind of secular crime in addition to being a religious one. So you get this change. And this means witchcraft becomes like in violation of civil law. And secular crimes were judged and punished by the state rather than the church. And these crimes were met with much harsher punishment than kind of religious crimes. So this is where you start to get executions and all this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, because even when it comes to exorcisms and things like that, the Catholic Church had very specific rules. And you would have to prove to the church that these things were actually occurring and it wasn't someone with mental illness or someone that was just, old and not everything was there, or they had other maladies or other cultural additions to this. So I thought it was really great, especially in the introduction, the distinction that was made between witchcraft as tried by the church versus witchcraft as tried by lesser clergy. And I feel like this entire book is basically the book of the lesser clergy. Or did I misinterpret this?
I'll talk a bit more about it in a second. Like, it was aimed at kind of 3 different places. So it was aimed at the clergy. It was also aimed at lawyers and stuff, which is all in section 3. And it was also aimed at another audience, but I'll talk about that in a second. But it's important to remember that the books on witchcraft do not necessarily indicate that this is everybody's perception of witchcraft at the time. It's contextually and geographically specific as well as personally specific. I'm going to flip around in this book. The Malleus Maleficarum in particular is a book based on the German experience. And so it should be really read in that light, with that in mind. This isn't necessarily, even though the Malleus has this kind of life today as this kind of very popular book on witchcraft, and people often like overblow how influential it was. It was very influential, but I'll talk a bit more about it. But the Malleus Maleficarum is written by Heinrich Kramer or Heinrich Instatoris, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong. Some say you'll often see that somebody called Jacob Sprenger is also listed as an author of the Malleus. Sprenger isn't actually added as an author till after his death. So I think like 20 something years after his death, he gets added. I'm not really sure why. And as Maxwell-Stuart, the kind of editor and author of this book, says, it's generally accepted that he's not the co-author of the Malleus, right? So the Malleus is published in 1487. But Heinrich Kramer lived from 1430 to 1505. He was a German churchman and inquisitor. He kind of distributes the Malleus Maleficarum, which describes witchcraft and endorses a kind of detailed process for the extermination of witches. He was instrumental in establishing the period of the witch trials in the early modern period. Professor Malcolm Gaskill, who's also a very well-known person in the area of witchcraft, has described Kramer as a superstitious psychopath. So he's not got good vibes, right? But there's been a lot of attempts to psychoanalyze Instatoris. Kind of Maxwell-Stuart makes this important point that using kind of post-Freudian theories actually doesn't help, because you're taking like a late 19th century obsession with sex into this kind of late 15th century preoccupation with supernatural terrorist threats. And Maxwell-Stuart makes this important point that it actually tells us nothing about him. It's like like with medical history, right? Going back and
Diagnosing.
yes, that's the word I'm looking for. Diagnosing somebody. Yeah, yeah.
It's there's a specific term for it. I think it's retrospective diagnosing.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, and you know, as practitioners of theory, it is fun to speculate, but when something is this old and we are so limited to the actual access to this person's everyday life, it's quite difficult to go back and give these diagnostics. And also, like you said, and as well as has been like emphasized within the text, sexuality was a very different thing. And interestingly enough, like within the text, as Maxwell-Stuart discusses, there's also a lack of homosexuality within the text. So there is this focus on women, mostly because homosexuality was also not something that was, I don't want to say completely understood, but maybe was not within the forefront of these issues. They had bigger fish to fry, and that fish were women, I guess.
Yeah, and we're gonna have a whole chat about the kind of the women of it all, right? Like, why were most of the people who were kind of accused of being witches women? And we'll talk more about that later because I think it's really interesting. But it's just one last thing on kind of Kramer, and I'm going to call him Kramer rather than Instatoris because I don't know if I'm saying it wrong. So we're going to say Kramer. But he, Maxwell-Stuart makes this really interesting point about how Kramer was like not well liked. He was very disliked by a lot of people, and he says, but being pig-headed and tactless are not sufficient to turn somebody into a monster. Although Instatoris's brutality during the Innsbruck examinations undoubtedly brings him close, and the novelty of the Malleus springs from a mind which may be quite alien to ours, but which indicates a man more complex than has sometimes been allowed. So really thinking about like, just because somebody's unlikable doesn't necessarily, that's not all they are. Do you know what I mean? And you have to think of historical people as full people that we don't know huge amounts about. Yeah.
Yeah, he was also kind of a god cop. You know, like no one really likes cops. Even if you are a cop, you're probably going, yeah, you know, and this is like a religious cop, you know?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So he was more than likely not well liked because if he showed up, he was probably a bad vibe. There's also that to take into consideration. You know, I thought, once more, it's really interesting how sort of the layers are added on before actually going into the overall text, because it really does contextualize something that I would not really understand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's heavily debated and lots of people argue about the translation, right? So I've already mentioned this, but there was a tendency in Montague Summers' account to equate witches with women. So I'm going to kind of talk from the book about how this happened. Instatoris acknowledges this, as did anyone else who wrote on these subjects in Latin, by using terms maleficae and maleficae to designate those who work harmful magic. The latter are specifically females, the former either males or males and females together, since the Latin masculine plural may either refer to men or include both sexes. Translating both Latin words by the English word witch is therefore potentially very misleading, since witch has come to imply a female only, but Instatoris frequently refers to maleficae, therefore tacitly recognizing that such people could be, and indeed were, both men and women. And so you have this issue of translation that has continued today, especially because the Malleus has this kind of popular imaginary, right? Yeah, so, and I have a few other slight bits on the translation because I think it is important and interesting. Oh, I find it interesting. So in pre-1960s English, the masculine pronoun is usually usually used, and all of this is quotations, by the way. It probably sounds like I'm quoting as well. It's usually used wherever a general point is being made and is meant to cover both male and female cases. Context, however, is everything, and it is the context which tells us or gives us a fairly clear indication whether the male pronoun is particular and specific, referent, or general and inclusive. Latin masculine plurals may indeed be inclusive of both genders, but Latin singulars are generally specific. So when Instatoris switches from masculine to female, it's significant. And so, so I think that's interesting. And then he says one last thing about Montague Summers also inadvertently feminized the Malleus more than the text warrants by translating Maleficus, Malefica, and Maleficae indiscriminately as witch or witches, and turned all male references in part 3 of the Malleus into female. Since the English word witch almost inevitably produces the image of a female in English-speaking consciousness, this has given and continues to give the impression of a text more targeted upon women than it actually is, hence the need for a fresh translation. So this is what this book is kind of bringing. The Malleus was written in interesting circumstances, right? So it was this kind of defense that Heinrich Kramer had for the decisions and lines of questioning. So he is doing his inquiries and examinations as an inquisitor, and he's particularly asking women about their sexual promiscuity. And so he puts women in prison, and then during this time they kind of release the women, the people around, particularly the kind of Bishop Golsa starts to release the women because he's like, your line of questioning is mad weird. Like, why are you asking all these women about their sexual promiscuity? It's freaking me out. And so they release the accused women and they ask him to leave Innsbruck. And then shortly after, he writes the Malleus. Because he's like, well, if you won't believe me that it's a threat, I'm going to make you see that it is a threat, right?
Yeah, it's very, as per my last email.
Yeah.
Energy. Yeah, it's also just like, he's writing this very angry. I can imagine. I think, as I'm learning more and more about history, people were mad, or angry for much longer than we are. These attention spans were much longer and much more intense. So this is coming out of a very passionate, not just from a professional standpoint, where it's like you're questioning me, my credentials, my expertise, and not only that, I had to move. She's like, new country, who is this?
Also, I've got a lot of, this is just a side note, I've got a lot of affection for emotion historians who I think get a lot of flack, but their kind of whole stick is being like, did happiness in the past look like happiness now? Or did anger look like anger now? Or did grief look like? I think it's really interesting because, like you said,
yeah.
It's not the exact same.
It's not the exact same, especially if you dedicate, even now, if you dedicate your life to the church, your job and your emotions are very closely tied. So I can only surmise, or better yet, I can only hypothesize just how intense and how complicated these feelings are, because it's someone's profession, it's someone's livelihood. To be called out like that, that is the beginning of a rap beef. As we are recording now after a legendary beef has ended, this is OG material.
Yeah. So the translation of the Malleus Maleficarum is Hammer of Witches. Which I think is pretty sick as a name. There's more in
It's so metal.
It is. There's more in the kind of text about that like why it's called the Hammer of Witches, but I will leave that for you to read and buy the book because it's not that expensive. But the Malleus Maleficarum is essentially this legal and theological document. It's considered this handbook of witchcraft, particularly how you detect and ascertain what a witch is, like where is it happening, how do I know? And this kind of was well into the 18th century. People were still kind of referring to the Malleus. And it's often seen as this kind of spurring on and sustaining witch hunting hysteria in Europe, which it was part of this, but it wasn't the only one. And it's commonly discussed as this kind of textbook on how to identify witches and write about what they did and show how they tried them in courts of law, which is sort of true. It's not really a manual. There's a really excellent quote from Maxwell-Stuart, who says, "It is a highly personal and very emotional book, not the best foundation for inquisitorial or secular proceedings against people seen as dangerous deviants, but one which vividly illustrates through the pen of a well-educated, ideologically motivated individual the collective intense disquiet of a zealous elite who, with the eternal good of their fellow citizens in mind, conceived it their duty to push back the frontiers of darkness before an imminent Armageddon." Sick quote. That was my favorite quote. But it's very true. Like Paolo was saying as well, it's this very angry, very emotionally led document. And it's split into 3 parts. So kind of who is it aimed at, right? Part 1 is addressed to fellow theologians. It's trying to show how there's a pact between workers of harmful magic and evil spirits, right? It's not a fantasy, it's a reality for them. I will talk a bit more about that a bit later, like what does it mean for magic to exist? It can be really hard to put yourself in that mindset, or maybe not so hard, depending on who you are and how religiously minded you are nowadays, right? Yeah, so this is a reality. He really ties the increasing numbers of witches in the sexual relations between women and evil spirits. It's really focused on demonology. Part 2 is for preachers and contains like very kind of various anecdotes and stuff that they can use in their sermons, popular beliefs, kind of talking about Satan and practitioners of magic. And part 3 is for judges, both ecclesiastical and secular. Kind of how do you arrest, examine, sentence workers of harmful magic, right? So those are the kind of 3 parts. He was really kind of aiming it, firing on all cylinders, right? The Malleus had kind of criticism at its time. I won't talk too much about that. It wasn't like just taken for fact. And it's interesting to think about the kind of direct influence, because it's published quite a few. There was 8 printings of the Malleus. It was written in Latin. It would have been read by kind of the elite. That's who, you know, he's aiming it at the elite, right? People who can read Latin. Witch hunts were already happening, right? So it's not starting witch hunts in particular areas. It's just kind of continuing them.
It's also coinciding with the creation of the printing press. So these are coming out around the same time. So it's not that the book is super revolutionary or it's newfound accessibility, because we had sort of printing-ish before, but it's a new form of acceleration. And, you know, you can't talk about virality and like mass consumption in the same way that you do now to back then. But with the creation of the printing press, especially in Germany, because I believe that's where it was first created or officially created. So these things kind of go together. And I don't find that's like, especially putting together dates and all these things, it's not very surprising that this was like, this has been considered to be the text of witch hunting. Not because of its like influence per se, it's a very influential, but not as influential as I had previously thought, but mostly because it coincided with things outside of itself.
Modern reactions to the Malleus, right? Maxwell-Stuart says this has varied from the measured to the hysterical, right? Like people go a bit wild around witchcraft. often leaning towards the latter. So there's a lot of myths, inaccuracies, also not helped by this mistranslation, right? Or this inaccurate translation. And yeah, so around the time of the Malleus, you have many other treaties. So you have many other people writing, intellectuals, legal theorists, jurists, thinking of the printing press as well. You have pamphlets. There's quite a few fun pamphlets happening at this time as well. Particularly, so in terms of books and these kind of manuscripts that are written, there's a few to mention. There's Jean Baudin's On the Demon Mania of Witches, Nicolas Remy's Demonolatry, and Henry Bequet's Examination, something of witches, right? Something about witches. And my favorite one of all, this is my favorite one, which I think we should cover at some point in the future, is King James I wrote a book on demonology. I think it's so interesting. It's super fun, like why he wrote this book. And so he writes about like demons and demonology and all this kind of stuff. And James I is a really interesting example because this is somebody who has intellectually the best education, right?
Well, I could put an asterisk to that and be like best access to education, or one of the best accesses to education, because the priesthood is also a fantastic access to education because they're the ones actually educating.
The study of witchcraft is just kind of a note on historiography, right? It's an incredibly well-researched area of study. Incredibly. It's very difficult to enter into. It exploded in the 1960s and kind of has continued ever since. It's very hard to find an angle that's not already been researched.
For better and for worse.
Yeah. There was a common misconception previously, and this was 1960s. This before the 1990s, right? There was a common misconception that the belief in witchcraft was a continuation of kind of medieval delusion and superstition, which is then destroyed by the rise of modernity, particularly scientific discoveries and legal professionalism. But there was some academics who deviated from this misconception, and they put forward arguments that witchcraft really existed, either as kind of a pagan cult or as diabolical worship. These are also wild. There's Montague Summers is one of these people, and Margaret Murray. Margaret Murray's book is very interesting. Hugh Trevor Roper is seen as this kind of pinnacle of witchcraft studies, right? So he writes this massive, it's like huge. He writes this massive book and he's really good, still really good. Some things are dated, yes. So he kind of says that witchcraft is born out of elite irrationality, right? And in particular to this kind of Reformation defeat of Erasmian humanism. I'm not going to explain that, it's complicated. But he still fell in line with the thinking that ordinary people believed witchcraft because of medieval superstitious hangovers. And then you get a kind of response to this from somebody called Keith Thomas, who says that witchcraft has it has to be studied through psychological explanation, sociological analysis, and intellectual explanation. So you need these kind of areas, and he's very focused on feelings. His account of witchcraft accusations hinges on feelings of guilt, for example, and the decline of witchcraft arises from this kind of unraveling of this mentality in educated thought. But yeah, that's just a few kind of notes on the historiography and how we've kind of changed. I think that obviously Maxwell-Stuart does a better job than I just did.
Yeah, because I also would be weary to associate it directly with the expansion of the sciences, mostly because this is like the end of like serfdom, because the plague comes in and obliterates like every single country, and how these systems of power were originally structured. Then there's Martin Luther like coming in hot and dismantling the Catholic Church slowly but surely. And out erupts like Protestantism, and these relationships completely alter. So yeah, like I wouldn't even say that witchcraft fully disappeared. It might have turned into homeopathic remedy or other practices that are not strictly religious but maybe like passed down. So it's very interesting with history. There is a need to open and close exactly where things start and where things end, and it has to be super clear, when in fact, especially given mistranslations, all these things, it also doesn't take into consideration male witchcraft and like how that also may have influenced contemporary science. So if anything, witchcraft lives on, baby.
Also, people forget that science was weird. I'm going to talk. My last point is about how they thought eyes work and vision works. Like, it was weird. Like, science was really strange.
Yeah, so I was reading the book yesterday at a pub with my partner just so that we can like work together and still have a social life. And when I read that people used to consider semen as blood,
Yeah.
but like male blood, I was just like, are you kidding me? What? You cannot compare these things. It's its own environment of their own beliefs, because that is what they thought. And in the same way you cannot equate, you also cannot wrap your contemporary mind around it fully. You can get there as close as you can, but you really can't really experience it. Unless you were actually there, so time travel needs to bring it back, I guess.
Oh my god, don't try and travel back there. It's scary. Scary vibes. Unless you're rich, which I guess you would be.
The sense alone, the smell.
Yeah.
The smell.
The smell would be
the
horrendous.
lack of seasoning.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think they've ever heard of cayenne, you know?
And yeah. Just bring back, like, in your bag. Got seasonings. They're like, witch! How do you make this food taste so good? Witchcraft is so good.
It's like the meme of, I want to give a Victorian child this thing, like a Mountain Dew, and see what happens. Like, I want to introduce them to like Cajun seasoning and see what occurs.
That would be good. So I'm going to go over kind of witchcraft in medieval and early modern Europe. I specialize, or you specialize more in early modern. So apologies if it like veers more there. But early modern Europe is often seen through the lens of the witch hunts, right? The numbers, by the way, this is probably out of date information. The demographic information for how many people died during the witch hunts is fluctuating. Demographics were hard back in the day. It's very hard. There was information, but it's hard to figure out. I know because I failed a class on medieval demography. Yeah, it's hard. But people say that around 100,000 people went on trial for the crime of witchcraft, with around half found guilty or executed. But these numbers are probably wrong. So take that with a pinch of salt. Witch hunts created, even if you weren't directly accused or you weren't really accusing other people, it created this sense of fear, right, that occupied everybody's thoughts of everyone in society, including the intellectual elite. The fear of witches is really important to understand. It wasn't just a fear of being accused. It was a fear that people were out to get you. They were going to make you sick. They were going to curse you and your family. They were going to kill your children, kill your crops and livestock. It was also used as an explanation for natural disasters, right? Imagine you don't have an explanation for why this is happening. And I can't remember which book it's in, maybe Keith Thomas, but there's an interesting discussion of people sending, so say, imagine you have a house, you've got your family in your house, and an old, decrepit kind of woman comes up to you and she's not doing well, she doesn't have a good social network, and she asks for your help. and you send her away because you are scared and you don't want to help her. And then, say a week later, your child gets sick and dies, right? Then you would blame that woman, right? You would blame her for being like a witch, right? Because obviously she cursed you for Paula's doing the witch. So obviously she cursed you, right? That's the notion. So even if something happened like a month later, 2 months later, people would blame people for cursing them because they refuse to help her, right? It's this kind of circular logic. There's a really good quote for this. I've just got in my notes like, oh, this is a fantastic quote. Yeah, so you have as well, right? It's not just obviously kind of peasants and everyday people. It's also the elite, right? And in particular, the elite is kind of forwarding this notion of witchcraft as evil, as connected to demonology, all this kind of stuff. And Maxwell-Stuart has this really great quote where he says, "It was the learned view which, as one might expect, prevailed in both ecclesiastical and secular courts, and the long history of witchcraft shows what appears to be a never-ending abrasiveness between the man on the bench and the man in the dock, as they fumble their way towards a kind of mutual understanding of the offences alleged and eventually tried," right? So you have this, the kind of everybody's trying to get on the same mindset, particularly the elite is trying to convince everyday people that witches are like a massive problem. And so, you know, there's also this notion put forward in the Malleus and other places that witches are trying to create this like conspiratorial anti-society. They're trying to create this heretical, idolatrous, apostatical, I can't say that word, but this kind of heretical anti-society, right? And if you're being told this as like just like an average person, and you know, think of today, right? Like there's been many witch hunts continued to this day. You know, when I was doing work in Salem, Massachusetts, one of the museums I looked at, I forget the name of it, but at the end of their whole exhibition, they had a thing of like witch hunts that have continued today. So you have things like the AIDS crisis, particularly going after queer and trans people. You have things like 9/11 going after American Muslim people, right? And so, or anybody who you perceive to look vaguely Muslim. And so you have this kind of witch hunts that have continued today. So if you put it in the mind of today, you can see how these things happen, right? And it's happening right now in scary ways, right? Like, yeah.
I was just gonna say it's witchcraft, and the fear of it is the othering. It is someone that's either odd because whatever reason, or a group of individuals that are thriving and you're jealous of them, because that was also a thing, because especially with the connections between anti-Semitism and witchcraft, it's mostly associated with the fear of the other and of a culture that is foreign to you. Yeah, so these things just don't stop, do they? They just morph and have new names and different definitions and policies. Kind of like how this is a manual of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting connections there, people.
Yeah. So around this time, right, there's a lot that causes this growth in fear and anxiety around witches. Again, geographically and contextually different for each place, but there's social and economic problems, changes in legal systems, and religious upheaval are these kind of preconditions for witch hunts happening. You know, kind of like today. Right? So the witch hunts appeared more often in borderlands between Catholic and Protestant regions. There's a kind of religious difference that's relied on witch hunts to kind of release these religious anxieties. Social economic problems, particularly in regions with large numbers of impoverished people or others, right, in quotations, such as Jewish people, ran higher risks of witch hunts. And you also have things like widespread crop failure, widespread disease will also lead to more people looking for something to blame, right? People are frightened, they're looking for something to blame. Also get this kind of magical beliefs in the medieval period going into the early modern period are very common. You have things like astrology, palm reading, divination, fortune telling, also things like herbalists. So if you can't have a doctor come see you, because there's, you know, lots of reasons why a doctor might not be able to see you, money being one of them, you might rely on like a local herbalist to help support you and make you feel better. But there's a lot of fear in that, right? Like, because if this person can make you feel better, they can also make you feel worse. You also have, in the upper classes, you have an obsession with alchemy. People were obsessed with transmutational alchemy. They wanted so desperately to turn base metals into gold. I was speaking to my partner about this because he does a lot of his focus is on sorry, I think there's a plane going up. He does research in debt. But he was talking to me about this yesterday because I was like, well, I don't know why they're so obsessed with it. And Dan was like, basically, like having base metals was like the bedrock of the economy. And so if you could learn how to turn your base metals into gold, then you would have a better economy, essentially, in very simple terms of what he was trying to say.
And it also connects back to like current time, like right-wing conspiracy stuff, where they sort of take well, this is a metal, this is a thing that can be used, that unlike paper will never quote unquote lose value. So all over the UK, we see a lot of cash for gold stuff. So like these things don't go away; they just continue on and have new lives.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you have in Coventry, there's loads of signs about like keep cash, like having cash is like more important. So yeah.
That is another right-wing thing that we can talk off mic about.
Yeah, 100%. They're also, the upper classes are also obsessed with creating an elixir of immortality. Obviously, you see it again with like right-wing grifters today. There's that guy who's like injecting his son's blood into him. Have you seen this guy? Yeah.
Yes, and they both look worse.
Yeah, it's almost like that shouldn't happen.
Well, this also connects back to like the New World stuff, because Puerto Rico, Cuba, Florida were all like not only being searched for spices and trade and all these things, but also the fountain of youth.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist. Stop pillaging us.
Yep, 100%. I've got a point that I'm going to read out verbatim from Maxwell-Stuart, but it is complicated and I don't have the kind of requisite knowledge to be able, or like I do, but it's too complicated. It'll take like a whole podcast. But one rationale came from religious beliefs, right, which argued that God or gods or demons enabled people to practice magic. So in this instance, people who perform magic, they do so thanks to supernatural beings. Aristotle's argument that the sublunary sphere operated as a microcosm for the superlunary sphere also resonated strongly with those who believed in magic. So astrology in this way makes perfect sense, as the impact of the stars in the heavens could be easily felt and observed on Earth, the way some flowers followed the sun during the day, or the impact of the moon on the tides, provided easy examples of how the stars influence people and things on Earth. Platonic and Neoplatonic arguments about the great chain of being, which is its own massive thing, kind of links between the distant planets and things on Earth, also provides this kind of strong intellectual belief and support for these kind of magical beliefs. So you have this like rock solid understanding, like they think magic exists, right? And size of witch hunts really vary drastically from place to place, with some cities and towns never having a hunt. Other places had many, many people accused. In Salem, Massachusetts is a really good example of like loads of people just breaking out and accusing people. That's why it's such a good kind of case study for this kind of stuff, right? And according to the Malleus, there are 3 types of people who a worker of harmful magic could not harm, right? So there's those who administer public justice against them. Very, of course, who would say this, right? or prosecute them in a public capacity.
Convenient. It's convenient.
Exactly, that's the word I'm looking for. Very convenient. Those who legitimately use the traditional revered rituals of the church, such as sprinkling of holy water, eating consecrated salt, carrying a candlestick on the day of purification, consecrated palm leaves on Palm Sunday, and when the church exercises such things so as they can be used to diminish the strength of evil spirits, and those who are considered blessed by holy angels, right? So these are the types of people who can't be influenced by a witch. And if you do end up influenced by a witch or like a worker of harmful magic, then I guess you weren't good enough, right? It's this idea. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's remnants of this practice in Catholicism when you move to a new home or all of this, you can get a priest to bless your home. My mom got her house blessed, just as a keeper of good vibes and keeping the home godly. My mom is a religious lady. Like let her believe, okay.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not like on people's beliefs, by the way. Like, if you want to believe, you believe. I kind of the last main topic that I want to discuss is women, right? What were women's place in witchcraft? Like, why were the vast majority accused and found guilty women? You do find examples, they're very rare, of men. Well, there's more examples of men. You do find very rare examples of children also being accused and executed and punished. Necromancy, for example, is seen as a specifically male thing. Like, only men can do necromancy because it requires a kind of theoretical basis or like understanding of the human body that women are assumed not to have because of like educational differences and stuff like this. A really good example of a kind of male practitioner of magic is the character Prospero in Shakespeare's The Tempest. Interestingly, and this is just a side note, people think Prospero offers a version of Shakespeare's retirement speech, as this is believed to be the last play Shakespeare wrote alone. So people think that Prospero is a stand-in for Shakespeare in this story. So if you ever read The Tempest, kind of read it through that lens. It's really interesting. But I think he did write a few things after that, which kind of undermines that argument. But in general, right, you have witches were primarily seen as older women without strong support network of friends or family. And a kind of important clarification for this is that the Malleus is obviously this kind of German influenced text. In Germany, the notion of the witch was particularly tied to this notion of an old woman looking a certain way, right? And so this isn't necessarily the case everywhere, but it's just an important clarification.
The German word for witches is actually Hexen. Yeah, witches, or Hex. Hexe. So to hex someone is also to be bewitched.
Interesting. That's good.
You're welcome. So this contemporary belief of witches is very much tied with language, which goes back to the importance of translating this correctly.
Yeah, exactly. So there's an argument put forth by Christine Larner, which is kind of how most people tend to think now, is that women were not accused because they were women, right? They were accused because they were seen to act like witches. And there's an important distinction there, right? It's a sex-related crime, not sex-specific. And so you have this idea that women were more likely to be seduced by the devil. They were seen as weaker emotionally. I have a quote from the Malleus itself, or the translation that we're looking at. Kind of now we come to another capacity of her essential being, namely her natural inclination. When she hates somebody she previously loved, she seethes with anger and cannot bear it. And just as the surge of the sea is always bubbling and running fast, so every bit of such a woman finds it unbearable. So you have this notion that women are weaker, emotionally, physically, and mentally. Women were perceived as less powerful in general. And so there's this notion that women would look to outside help, so the devil, for example, to help them. It's quite extreme, but there's this idea. It's also seen, and maybe I'm wrong here and I'm remembering it wrong, but I did try to look this up, but women were seen as more porous generally, right? This is going to be a bit disgusting, but women have more holes for the entry of evil spirits than men. So you have, and I'm taking this, I taught on a module by Claudia Stein at the University of Warwick about human nature, and part of what she looks at is demonic possession and stuff like this, right? So divine and demonic possession is literally the notion that something is entered into your body. This does not happen through the mouth. It often happens through the bowels and other viscera of the body. Demons could not enter your heart, though. Only God can enter your heart. But demons often dwelled in the unclean areas of the body, digestive tracts, and exorcism happens through openings, like getting the demons out of the openings of your body. Yeah.
There's also what Maxwell-Stuart mentions is like, there's also the notion that women are incomplete. You know, this is not based on gender, this is based on sex. So with women's bodies being able to receive, they cannot be an active, in their beliefs, women cannot be an active participant in sexual intercourse. So they're able to be pierced. They're able to be not just entered, but like inserted into. So male practitioners work a very different type of magic because they do not have these orifices at their disposal. They only have one, you know? So women were seen especially weak. And then with women's connections to Eve and being of man's body, they're automatically just lesser because they come from the rib rather than the soil of God's creation.
Exactly, right? And you have this like, yeah, because of the kind of sexual intercourse, again, it's kind of gross, but this notion that women are entered into, they're also seen as more sexually, what am I trying to say? Horny, essentially. They're seen as lustful. They're seen as like...
promiscuous.
Yeah. Right? They're seen as more promiscuous because the kind of notion is that in physiology at the time, the womb was seen as cold, and so yearning for the heat of a man's semen. And so you have this like wanting to have that happen, right? You also have an important distinction is this, all of this is not seen as women's fault, right? It's not something women are choosing, and it's not a weakness of their own character. It's just seen as like inherent to how women are. That's seen as like natural to them. Also, women are seen as like more... I want to read out this quote actually from Maxwell-Stuart because I think it gives a good example. So in Theoryish, who's as a reminder, he's the person who wrote the Malleus, right? He lists women's usual weaknesses. They're backbiting, vengeful, lascivious, impressionable, and intellectually inferior, before saying that these wicked women, and this qualification is important, are particularly ruled by three moral failings: infidelity, right? Ostentation and lust. So women are seen as like inherently a problem. I've got another thing. Because semen equals blood, ejaculating for men was seen as a draining of their life force. So women were seen as essentially a little bit like vampires, right? And so they sucked out men's lifeblood. And so you get this like
It's the fear of the succubus.
Yeah. Oh, I found the quote. All of this, right? I found the footnote. It's on page 14. This is not a kind of misogyny in the way that today's misogyny works. Instatoris and other writers on witchcraft were certainly kind of heirs to long tradition of literary misogyny, but it's not the same thing as practical or even actual diminishment of women. But that does not mean to say that they were influenced by it at every turn. Given the premise of the insatiable womb, the necessity to control it becomes entirely logical. There's an article from an academic called Samantha Richards who talks about the representation of monsters as dragons in particular as these kind of sexualized females. And so they aren't simply just female, they're standing in for a particular type of femininity, right? It's sexual, it's bestial, it's like the very worst of women, right? A lot of this kind of ideology and thinking is essentially saying that we need to protect women from themselves, right? Because they can't protect themselves because they're insatiable.
Yeah, it also goes into other like fears about women and like potential death. This came up when I was discussing the book with my partner, whose sister works at the Charles University in Prague on witchcraft, and he was telling me about the wandering womb and how it was this fear about, there's two types of wandering wombs. There's the very, very early modern one that she works with, which is the womb that can leave the woman's body and, rummage around to get pregnant by another. And then there is the later, like 1700s, 1800s, literal wandering womb that can move about in the body and cause death. So it's like this preoccupation with certainty of women's reproduction and how to best control it, because you can't. So it's this lack of knowledge, because we still don't really know anything about women's bodies, let's be honest. But these leanings of magical reading into women's reproduction as an answer or as a form of analyzing. And this once more connects back to witchcraft in that these things were really difficult to explain unless you had been through it before. So someone that was older that had experienced this may have a bit more knowledge. And this is where things get really muddled and really messy. Yeah, that was just my point. I wanted to talk about the wandering womb because that thing is crazy.
No, that's really good. That's good. Women were also seen as like inherently, again, going back to language, right? Inherently is lacking in faith. So from the Malleus itself, he writes about the etymology of the word woman, because femina is derived from faith, and minus less, right? So women always will have less faith than men because they're attaching it to the kind of etymology of this word. And the difference between kind of male witches or male magicians, I guess, is that they're making quite often a conscious decision to work their ritual in a specific way to achieve a specific end, whereas women are seen as passive instruments of the hands of demons, spirits, something else that is masculine in nature, right? But a kind of last point I want to make is that the Malleus in particular kind of focuses heavily on women because Instatorius is also the kind of witchcraft cases he's seeing around him in Ravensburg and Innsbruck in the mid 1480s were dominated by women, right? So he's essentially reporting on what he's seeing. Again, thinking about the German context, but also directly his kind of lived experience, it's happening in this kind of particular way. To kind of finish off, I just to give you an idea of like how bizarre all of this is, there's a quote that I thought was really interesting and also it wasn't explained in depth, right? Because it's very hard to explain. So I thought I would just explain it. And so he says at the top of page 8, there were, again, talking about the woman being cold, yearning for the heat of man's semen, and women's imaginative faculty, that is the part of the brain which received impressions from exterior sources and stored these as images, was more susceptible than that of a man. Again, women are inherently porous, right? They're seen as these porous beings. The frequent stories about women looking at a particular object during their pregnancy only to have recognizable aspects of that object reproduced in their fetus, right? So I just wanted to explain like what that means, and how vision worked, like how they thought eyes worked and like seeing works, right? So our own understanding of how vision works comes into play in the 18th and 19th centuries. And before this, they felt that the eyes worked in a particular way, and they're informed by Aristotle. So Aristotle, and I'm very, very much simplifying this, says that everything you see and everything in the world is essentially radiating little copies of the real object. So real copies of that object are radiating off objects, and those copies are transported and picked up by your eye. So when you see something, the eye transports that copy into itself, and then these copies and representations are taken to the brain. And so you get this story of pregnancy because women are essentially seen as more porous. Those objects are ending up in their fetus, right? Because they see the eyes working in a particular way, right? Science was weird, they're bizarre, and that is the end of me talking about witchcraft.
It reminds me of like, you know how like people play music for when they're pregnant so that the baby could like enjoy the music. It's the same thing. I'm not a medical anything. I should not step back into science ever again. But it kind of feels like that. So this was absolutely fascinating, Hannah. This was like not just like, obviously thank you very much to Manchester University Press, because I'm not gonna lie, I would not have read it without like being influenced by them and by you. And also obviously thank you very much to Maxwell-Stuart, because this was very much made in mind of like you and I, listeners, for people that don't know anything about this. So it was a really interesting perspective to sort of dive deep into it. And I got a lot other things out of this, not just in terms of witchcraft, but the sort of early rumblings of anti-Semitism within the medieval era. And yeah, it's been really fascinating. And yeah, how did you feel now after, after now like discussing it and, finally using your master's degree? How do you feel?
I feel good. I hope it was enjoyable and interesting, and yeah, I hope listeners enjoyed. I think witchcraft is just so interesting as a topic. It's just so bizarre and like, yeah. So you get so much weird stuff happening at this time. It's my favorite.
And to anyone that thinks that all these things have gone away, Ronald Reagan had a horoscope person on like he paid money for this. So if you're thinking this all went away, no, it didn't. This stuff still is out there. And is it bad? Is it good? Depends on the person. All I know is Ronald Reagan is still dead. And now we were kind of having a hard time doing immediate connection for this because I immediately thought of very kitschy stuff, but I'm just gonna lean in. I'm gonna lean into the kitsch. So for not for children, suggestion is a book by an independent author. The book is called Maggie's Grave, by David Sodergren, and it's really fun pulp novel read. It's free on Kindle. It's £10 paperback. I believe it's only sold through Amazon. Yeah, it is about this woman that was accused as being a witch. She gets executed and comes back to haunt a town. It's a wild horror comedy type of thing, so it's very fun. And the more palatable suggestion is the 1999 animated perfection movie, Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost.
Amazing. I have a terrible recommendation for everybody. It is actually terrible, but it's the only thing I can think of. Do you know the 2005 film Bewitched, based off the TV show? It's got Nicole Kidman and Will Ferrell in it. It's terrible. Like, it got a 24% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. All the awards pretty much that it was nominated for were like worst actor, worst screen couple, worst director, most intrusive musical score, worst resurrection of a classic TV series, most annoying fake accent. It didn't win most of these. It did win worst screen couple. But yeah, I recommend that. It's the only thing I can think of, so.
I love it. It's wild. I can't believe I was the one with the normal Rex this time.
It was the only thing that was coming to my mind.
He giveth, he taketh.
I desperately want to watch this again, and I don't know why. It's been like occupying a lot of space in my brain.
You're not alone. Well, you know I'm a fan of bad movies. I recently rewatched When Mars Attacks. It's bad. It's great, but it's bad. So it's okay to hold things that your childhood self loved.
Anyway, we will let our listeners go. Yeah, thanks for listening. We had a few hiccups with my internet specifically, or the university's internet. I won't take ownership. It's the university's problem. But the internet kept disconnecting, so I think we've done a good job of like talking around it. But if there's any disconnects, that's kind of why that was happening. But yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to Manchester University Press for sending us the book. And thank you so much also to the author/translator Maxwell-Stuart for recommending which sections for us to read. And yeah, this was fantastic. So with that said, do you want to say a long goodbye?
Yes, let's do it. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter at Theoryish_pod for up-to-date information, and please rate, follow, and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.
See you next time.
Goodbye.